the 1st of August, 1821, exactly 200 years ago yesterday, Elizabeth Inchbald died at her home in Kensington. She was 67, and her career as an actress, as a writer, and as a critic was remarkable by any standard. Inchbald acted for 17 years, beginning at the age of 18 in 1772 as a strolling actress, and ending her career as an actress on the stages of Covent Garden and the Haymarket in London in 1789. But success really arrived for Inchbald in the summer of 1784, when her farce, The Mogul Tale, delighted audiences at the Haymarket Theatre. This was the first of, if I've counted correctly, 19 plays staged at the major London theatres across the following 2 decades. And during this time, Inchbald was the most prolific and the most successful playwright in Britain. Inchbald also published 2 novels, the much celebrated A Simple Story of 1791, as well as Nature and Art of 1796. And through the countless prefaces she wrote for the 25-volume British Theatre between 1806 and 1809, Inchbald established herself as the premier drama critic of the first decade of the 19th century. In all, Inchbald was at the centre of theatrical and literary life in late 18th century London, at various times counting among her friends the likes of William Godwin, Thomas Holcroft, Maria Edgeworth, Thomas Lawrence, Sarah Siddons, and John Philip Kemble. Her life, work, and achievements are remarkable, and to help us celebrate them today, I'm joined by a wonderful panel of Inchbald experts and enthusiasts. I'll introduce our panelists now so we can hear as little as possible from me and as much as possible from our panelists and then from our audience. I'm David Taylor, based at the University of Oxford. I specialise in 18th century theatre, and I'll be chairing the roundtable today. Our 5 panelists in alphabetical order are Misty Anderson, who, at least on my screen, is at the bottom right. Misty is the James R. Cox Professor and Head of English at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She's the author of Imagining Methodism in 18th Century Britain and Female Playwrights in 18th Century Comedy, the latter of which looks extensively at Inchbald. Our second panelist is PAULA BACKSCHEIDER, top left for me, who is the Philpott-Stevens Eminent Scholar at Auburn University, Alabama. PAULA is the author of many, many books, including Daniel Defoe, His Life, Spectacular Politics, and 18th Century Women, Poets and Their Poetry. Her new book, Women in Wartime, Theatrical Representations in the Long 18th Century, will be out later this year with Johns Hopkins University Press. PAULA's 2-volume Plays of Elizabeth Inchbald, published by Garland in 1980, remains the authoritative edition of Inchbald's works for the stage. Our third panelist is Colin Blumenaau, writer, director, and actor. Colin is currently artistic director of the Production Exchange, London, and from 1996 until 2012, he was the artistic director of the Theatre Royal Bury St Edmunds. During this time, Colin spearheaded the restoration of this late Georgian playhouse, and as part of the Restoring the Repertoire programme, he directed full productions of 3 of Inchbald's plays, including the world premiere of her play, The Massacre. Our fourth panellist is Katie BONNA, writer, performer, and teacher. In 2012, Katie won a Scotsman Fringe First Award for her comedy Dirty Great Love Story, co-written with Richard Marsh, which transferred to the Arts Theatre in London's West End in 2017. In 2018, Katie won the Off West End Award for Most Promising New Playwright for her solo show, All the Things I Lied About. But today we're most likely to be hearing from her about a different solo show that she wrote and performed in 2009, the title of which was The Celebrated Mrs Inchbald. Last but by no means least, we have Lisa Freeman, Professor and Head of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Lisa is the author of Characters, Theatre, Genre and Identity on the 18th Century English Stage, and also of Anti-Theatricality and the Body Public. And Lisa's essay on Inchbald's criticism came out in Theatre Survey earlier this year. Thank you to all our panelists and welcome. So what I'll ask each of our panelists to do to start us off is just to speak for a few minutes about their own engagements with Inchbald, how they're approaching Inchbald, how they know Inchbald, perhaps also something about how Inchbald speaks to them and might speak to us today. So we'll start with PAULA, please. Thanks, PAULA.
Thank you, and I'm so happy to be at this wonderful event. I edited all of Inchbald's plays while I was teaching her novels, and I was an assistant professor. Clearly, someone had not explained tenure to me. But anyway, I was struck immediately by how many kinds of plays that Inchbald wrote. French problem comedies, creative bubbles like the Mobile Tale, topical main pieces, political statements embedded in genre pieces and farces. And I've been bred on the usual Congreve, and I didn't know great playwrights did that with so many forms. I also collected representations of Inchbald, and she was a very beautiful woman and into late old age. In 1784, when she was in her 30s, she was playing a Bridges part of Florimel. And people don't often think about her as that kind of beautiful performer at the time she was writing plays. She was very tough and determined. I think back then, when I felt very overworked, the fact that she covered all of her mirrors when she was writing a play so she would not be distracted was really an interesting and strategic thing. And I think if I had to say what I learned about Inchbald, except her writing many kinds of plays, was just how strategic she was. She found so many ways to make political statements. Catherine Green, for instance, pointed out that so ideologically fraught was the season of Everyone Has His Fault, that it was the sole politically inflected new main piece ventured at either of the patent theaters. That's the play where one of the characters says over and over, bread is so scarce. And this was in the middle of the suspension of habeas corpus. So what was the persona she had that made that possible? Another thing about tough and strategic is that we need to know more about how she got access to the production of so many kinds of plays. For instance, one of her tricks was knowing exactly what Covent Garden owned. So if you think about it, you could get a play more easily produced if you didn't need new sets and expensive lighting effects and things. And we have never really thought about the diversity of her kinds of plays and what Covent Garden owned and how she took advantage of that. She also obviously learned to have the skill in dramaturgy that men had, men who were actors, playwrights, and managers, and somehow she got it. For instance, sets, special effects, entrances and exits, all you have to do is look at the blocking and timing of Sir Robert's scenes in Everyone Has His Faults. It's just masterful. And so she's in a special group of playwrights whose education we could really study in more detail. I think that there's a lot of Inchbald criticism on individual plays. And one of the reasons, I think, is that if you start out with a bigger picture, her plays are so rich and profound, and the dramaturgy is so sophisticated that it eats all the time and space you have. So one of the things that I see us now turning to is contextualizing in myriad ways. For instance, consider her lifelong awareness of confinement in kinds of rooms, Turkish gardens, Indian prisons, the grim jail scene in Wives as They Were. And I'd like to see us precipitate out and submit to exegesis some of the things like that come from sets and scenes. I think in a way, Misty has done that for us with Marriage. The second thing that I've always wanted exploited more in Inchbald's work is what I've always seen as her riveting explorations of social justice, grounded in code ethics versus situational ethics. I don't know another playwright who over and over puts situational and code ethics in dialogue and in deep conflict the way she does. Everyone Has His Faults has a story of a veteran returning from the American War. And only 4% of the people in David's and my countries have experience with active military. So in other words, what we saw beginning with Vietnam were veterans coming back with many needs unmet, and they were largely overlooked. And so looking at Inchbald's military captain shows us how relevant her plays were and how we can look at that. William Godwin, for instance, observed with anger and disappointment that Lord Norland was reduced by the actor to a very harmless animal, while as written, Norland was, quote, a lion hungering for his prey, end quote. That can make Inchbald's veteran and the homeless people camping on our sidewalks chide us and invite us to consider again the interplay of the two theories of ethics, as Norland is the representative of code ethics. Thank you, and I look forward to everybody's discussion.
Thanks so much, Paula, for getting us off to such a terrific start. Already so much, I've got so many questions and so much to discuss. Thanks so much. We'll turn now to Katie Bonner. Katie, over to you.
Hi. So yes, I wrote a play about Elizabeth Inchbald and became her for a couple of years. And the sort of incarnation of that project sits with Colin Blumenaau, who was directing Wives as They Were at the time. I think that's correct. Is that correct, Colin? Yes. And decided to bring her back along with the play. And so I was brought in as a writer-performer to research her life and to write something about her life. And I came to it knowing nothing. All I knew, I did actually audition for Wives as They Were, but I didn't get in, which actually ended up being the best way around because I got to be Elizabeth Inchbald instead for a couple of years. But my only knowledge of her was that play, which I loved. And that's why I was so disappointed about not getting into it. And I found it incredibly fresh and surprising and challenging and exciting. So I got the job and basically was given a British Library card and 6 weeks to research her and write this play. So it was really important for me to focus on my gut instincts around what I was drawn to. And I didn't have time to read all of her work. She's written so much. So I read what had been written about her, which was quite scarce in terms of published text and easily accessible texts. But that in a way was quite useful again, because it wasn't too much to sort of comb through. And there were many, many aspects of her which I really, really related to. She grew up in a small rural town like I did. She had a terrible speech impediment when she came to acting, and she had to overcome that. That was similar to me. She was drawn to acting, and then she found her sort of creative satisfaction in writing. So there were lots of, on the surface of it, similarities and things that I related to. But the aspect of her that I was most drawn to, and what I ultimately ended up writing the play about, was the fact really that there isn't that much available about her life. And because she was a tremendously private person, she believed in keeping herself private. She believed in sustaining the outward appearances in order to maintain people's investment in her work and belief in her, and to keep people celebrating her, essentially. And I found that really fascinating, particularly when I read that she had written her life and she decided to burn it rather than to publish it. And I read that was on the advice of her confessor, but also on the advice of some of her friends as well. And so the story that I wrote was about that. It was imagining that she had written her life and she had been challenged on it, and she was challenging that person who I sort of assigned the audience that role of the challenger. she was challenging that person right back and showing them exactly why she should publish it. And so she dived, they cut the script like a pack of cards and dived into different moments in her life. And she talked about them, and she talked about why they should be there and why she wasn't doing anything wrong or saying anything wrong, until she finally arrives at Mary Wollstonecraft, who I just found a fascinating figure in her life, and on whom there is so much written, and who is so famous and so well known, and who is so widely quoted and so widely thought of as a founder feminist in a way that Elizabeth Inchbald is so widely not thought about or not even known about. And that became very interesting to me. And in fact, that sort of became the story, because Mary Wollstonecraft did the opposite to what Inchbald did. She was very public about her feelings, and she published a lot about herself during her life, which became scandal. And then Godwin wrote about her life after she died in a very honest way. And at the time, Inchbald believed that in doing that, she was going, you know, she'd been all of Wollstonecraft's achievements in her life would go for nothing. And my take on it was that that was a huge part of why Inchbald decided not to publish her own life, was because she didn't want to be forgotten. And the great irony of that, of course, is that in the modern day, she widely has been. And so that for me felt like the great, a great sadness and a point of human interest. And that was what I was really drawn to and focused on in the final piece.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm sure people later on are going to have more questions for you about the experience of writing and performing as Inchbald, but already you've given us a fascinating insight. Next up, we'll turn to Misty Anderson. Misty, over to you.
Thank you, David, so much for organizing this. And I also want to take this opportunity, it's an honor to be with you all today, but to thank Colin for diving into the archive of Inchbald's work and producing such an amazing series at Theatre Royal at Barry. It was this sort of sweet torment for an American scholar like me to have to return back to the States in August, just as everything was cranking up. So I believe I've saved every piece of print publicity about these and never got to see them. So we're all looking forward to seeing the scene in just a little bit. I've written about Inchbald in my first book and in a piece that's forthcoming in Elizabeth Inchbald's World, which will be out from Delaware in a few months. And I also have staged some of them as readers' theater, fancy table readings, and really thought about the dramaturgical genius of Inchbald through that process. David asked me to speak a little bit about divorce and marriage in Inchbald's work. And, you know, Inchbald wrote about marriage. Of course, she had to. If she was going to write stage comedy, that is the very stuff of it. But she voted with her feet personally. When widowed at 25, she never remarried.
Has anyone else lost Misty?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, what we'll do, given that Misty has disappeared for us, is leaving us with a cliffhanger, is if we turn to Lisa, and then we can hear more from Misty when she's able to reconnect. Lisa, are you able to jump in?
Absolutely, yeah, happy to do. And sorry, we just lost Misty. I just want to echo her and saying how wonderful it is to be part of this panel. And how excited I am to see the clip and to discuss the clip from Colin's production. So it's great to see everyone here today to celebrate Elizabeth Inchbald. And I just want to follow up on what Paula has already said and what Misty was starting to say about Inchbald's dramaturgical genius, right? Her brilliance in imagining entrances and exits, and that she was just had an incredible sense of stagecraft. And this is something that I argue she carried over into her criticism in looking at other plays and commenting on them as part of her remarks for the British Theatre, which was truly one of the most remarkable achievements in 19th century criticism, and an early contributor to the ways in which we can think about drama, not just as an artifact on the page, but in fact as live texts that need to be enlivened and performed on stage. And what really distinguishes her criticism, to my mind, is the way she brings a very kind of clear-headed distinction between what it means to read something on the page and to watch it be produced on the page. What was playable, what wasn't playable, or what didn't play well on her own contemporary stage, and approaching her criticism in that manner, whether it was her own plays or Shakespeare's plays or any other contemporary playwrights' plays. She was really able to bring a kind of fundamental understanding about what might work and what didn't work, and what distinguished the kinds of skills and sensibilities. What do playwrights understand? And in particular, what she was able to understand, and I think this is something that PAULA and Katie were getting to, it's her experience as well as an actress. She had a sense of the stage, and these were all incredibly important parts of her own calculus. Her sense of the audience tastes and interests. What were the players' acting abilities? In whose hands could she entrust her own plays? And in this sense, she was approaching the theater as a set of interactive engagements, not as something that was static, right? She was thinking it very much so as performance, and understood that to write for the stage was as distinct an art with respect to novel writing as in some ways it was to write closet drama, as did her contemporary Joanna Bailey. And she understood and had a few cutting remarks to make about that. And that's one of the things I love about her criticism, is she doesn't really pull any punches. She's very wry and sardonic and witty. Her critical and theoretical interests really lie in this thing I call dramatic probability, right? Which is the kind of believability of action. How do we enter into the theatrical reel that is produced on a stage, that emerges out of this kind of wonderful conjunction of the playwright's craft, the conventions of genre, which again, PAULA was talking about the many genres that she engaged with, and her sense of the actor's genius. Where does the actor fill in gaps left by the playwright to be filled in? And in this sense, she was incredibly innovative and daring in her criticism, bringing all of her experiences to the way that she engaged the plays. And I just want to also share, right, some criticism that she had of her own plays in this sense, right? All of this is kind of neatly encapsulated in her own remarks on her own play, which we're going to see a little clip of, Wives as They Were and Maids as They Are, in which she writes about herself as a playwright in the third person, and which opens as follows. Quote, "The writer of this drama seems to have had a tolerable good notion of that which a play ought to be, but has here failed in the execution of a proper design. Here are both fable and characters to constitute a good comedy, but incidents, the very essence of a dramatic work, are at times wanting and at other times ineffectual. The first act promises a genuine comedy, and the authoress appears to have yielded up her own hopes with reluctance. In the dearth of true comic invention, she has had recourse at the end of her second act to farce, though she certainly knew that the natural and the extravagant always unite so ill that in the combination the one is sure to become insipid or the other revolting." This is her judgment of her own play, but she goes on at some length about all the play's shortcomings, but then she adds towards the end of this set of comments, quote, "Yet even in its present imperfect state, assisted by the art of excellent acting, it was most favorably received on the stage, and may now, without the charm of scenic aid, afford an hour's amusement to the reader." And this is the sense of very clear-headed criticism that she wrote, but also affording, right, the possibility that something that we might think is weak on the page could actually be filled in by an actor's genius. And she had an enormous amount of respect for that. And this, I think, too, is in essence what we're trying to learn as part of the mission of R18, right? That is what makes certain plays from this era playable on the stage in our era. And in that sense, I'm very much looking forward to Colin's remarks momentarily about staging Wives as They Were, and hoping that we will see much more Inchbald on the stage in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. I can see that Misty's rejoined us. Misty has now taken the award for the most dramatic exit and re-entrance. Mm-hmm. So you left us on a real cliffhanger, Misty. So we look forward to hearing what you were going to say.
Yes, let me attempt some abbreviated remarks here with fear and trembling at the technology that I'm experiencing today. I believe I left you with Inchbald voted with her feet when it came to marriage. And PAULA, BACKSCHEIDER, Lily Annabelle Jenkins, Catherine Benhammer, many others, and I have written about her work in light of rising divorce rates, critiques of marriage, what was divorce in Scotland and France. But there were also other events that were clearly shaping her views of marriage, including Harris's attempted rape, as well as the behavior of the Prince Regent, the scandal of Emma Hamilton, and so on. But we find again and again, it's difficult or complicated to pin the term feminist on Inchbald. Her politics and her attitudes can appear moderate in relation to, say, Macaulay's or Barbauld's or Wollstonecraft's. But part of that problem is our liberal conception of feminism in terms of rights and property arguments, when Inchbald was very clear that, as Anne Mellor put it, England is not the land of liberty that it thinks it is, and that autonomous subjects are never really autonomous. So in the context of that political climate and what it means to critique marriage, I see her plays, especially her comedies, as truly radical experiments. And Jane Moody and Danny O'Quinn have agreed in different ways in depicting despotism and slavery and absolutism and empire in the context of comedies and attaching that to critiques of marriage. So as practice as a corrupt institution. And it's notable that she did not break off her relationship, her friendship with Godwin, even after political justice in 1793 calls for the abolition of marriage. She does break with Godwin and Wollstonecraft in particular after their marriage and the announcement of the pregnancy. And I have to thank Dr. Willow White for reminding me of that scathing letter that Inchbald wrote to Wollstonecraft after explaining that she was not going to share a box with her after this announcement. She said, "If I have done wrong, when you next marry, I will act differently." Certainly, Godwin and Wollstonecraft appeared to be as critical of marriage as Inchbald was, but their marriage, which has been written about from many different angles, was a different kind of insult to our politics. So briefly in the plays, and Everyone Has His Fault, which PAULA has already talked about, Sir Robert compels a Scottish divorce. In I'll Tell You What, Lady Euston means both Harriet and Miss Woodburn, sort of the basic comic shtick of the play. But in the scene that we'll see from Colin, we see Lady Priory, a fascinating character, who also is a great example of something that may not be as obvious on the page, that it would be so compelling on stage. Lady Priory claims that all men are tyrants, and she says, "I make the choice to obey my husband." So in that scene, which we will get to see, we have a reworking of the Amanda and Worthy structure from the Relapse. But what Elizabeth Inchbald is running is a new kind of experiment. It's about the possibilities of integrity in a corrupt sexual and political landscape, and an attempt to imagine what kind of ethics, and I'm so glad that PAULA brought up the dialogue between situational and code ethics, what kind of sexual and political ethics is possible in the face of tyranny. And here I think we have an example of the stakes of what it means to be a prudent woman, as Lisa Freeman has recently argued, and why that is not about a simple sexual mores, but a broader ethical question. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Misty. Thank you. And already I can see this kind of dialogue developing between your different ideas and views. So quite deliberately, I've saved Colin Blumenau until last. We'll be seeing in a few moments a clip from Colin's 2008 production of Wives as They Were and Maids as They Are from Bury St Edmunds. But first, we're going to hear from Colin about his experience of staging and directing Inchbald. Thanks, Colin.
Well, like everybody, let me echo my thanks to you for arranging this and get my excuses in rather quickly, rather like I think Inchbald was doing about her play, that it's very easy to downplay your own ability and your own foresight, I suppose. And I put my association with Inchbald down to nothing but coincidence, frankly. And my understanding of her has grown from, rather like Katie's, a position where there was absolutely nothing in my head about her, to a place where there was a little bit about her, not nearly as much as the academics who I share this round table with, unfortunately, but that's the way of things. I was fortunate enough in 1996 to be asked to run the Theatre Royal in Bury St Edmunds, which, as you may or may not know, is the only remaining example of a Regency playhouse in the world, obviously in this country, but also in the world. For years, it had been used as a local theatre, and nothing wrong with that. But the advent of the National Lottery in this country in the early 20th century meant that suddenly there were resources around where we could restore the fabric of the buildings that made up the theatre heritage of this country. And we were fortunate enough to get a decent grant in order to restore the building back to its Georgian splendour. That in itself was not enough for me, and I wanted a decent artistic reason to do that. I'd been told ever since I was at university in the late 1970s, that good drama stopped after the Restoration and started again at the end of the 19th century. I couldn't believe it then, and I refused to believe it when faced with this 150-year gap that was actually the heyday of the theatre that I was running. And it was very simple to go to the archives, to read some of the plays, find a playwright who had happened to be born in Bury St Edmunds, and stumble coincidentally on one of the premier writers of the period. We're always told that after the Rivals and She Stoops to Conquer, there's nothing worth the candle. Clearly not the case. And Inchbald is such a shining example, but she is one of many that I worked with over those 10 years, 15 years at Bury, to try and revivify that whole repertoire that people had shamelessly consigned to the dustbin for so many years. And it comes down to some of the things that the other participants, the other people have been saying, that these plays don't live on paper. They live in the mouths of actors, and hopefully I will talk very little more and let the actors do the work for me. But I would say that always you read a play on the paper and you can analyze it, you can dissect it, you can thematize it, if that word exists, and you can apply your own particular disciplines of academia to its politics, to its humanism, to the fact that and this is something I firmly believe, that these plays provide a crucible of all modern experience that you can draw from and see where we get to now, and that's why they live on the stage. But actually, it's only when the brilliance of actors gets to work with them that you can see that they have more than the sum of what you originally thought were their parts. And this play in particular, we worked and worked and worked on to get a satisfactory resolution, because on paper, the resolution is unsatisfactory. You experience the whole of the political debate around, let's call it feminism, but isn't, of the play, but then the neat bundles or the neat little bows that are tied around the play at the end make you wonder what on earth the woman was doing. And it felt to us ultimately as a company, as a director and actors and designer, that there was some coded messaging going on. And that coded messaging became very clear once the actors started working with it. And we were able to give a production that, yes, traced all of the elements that we'd been talking about, but ultimately left the audience to decide what the fate of the characters were in their own heads. We didn't make those decisions for them. And that, to me, is entirely consistent with how you should work with Georgian drama, with 18th century drama, because the audience, and this is something that is so often forgotten, is the forgotten extra character. The audience is complicit with everything that goes on that stage. The audience is the friend, the audience is the confidant, the audience is the critic, the audience is the censor. The audience is the people to whom the actors turn and physically ask for their opinion. And once they do that, then you begin to realize that these plays are not only just brilliant, witty, funny expositions of the craft, but they're also provocations for an audience to respond to and have their own sometimes spoken response to. You know, the idea of an audience coming back to an actor on stage during the currency of the actual playing wasn't unknown, of course. And that was something we discovered in Bury, that if you encourage the audience to speak back to you, they would, and they would help you deliver the messaging of the particular play. So what we learned was how to include an audience rather than play to an audience. And I think if I was advising anybody how to do this work, it was always to think that there was another person in the room. And that the rest of it is really easy. You get a brilliant designer to design something, you get brilliant actors to act it, you get a brilliant lighting designer to light it, and hey presto, you've got something that people enjoy watching, which is the purpose of it. I think probably rather than me ramble on, it's better to play it and then we can have a look at it and see what we think.
Thanks so much, Colin. Colin is being very humble, I should say. Echo Misty Anderson saying just how grateful I am, and we all should be, to Colin for the kind of unbelievable work he did at the theatre at Bury, and certainly the most exciting times in the theatre I've had were at that theatre, and in particular this production. So I'm delighted and excited to be able to share with you this clip from Colin's production of Wives as They Were and Maids as They Are, as I say, 2008. For those of you who don't know the play, it was performed in 1797. And the clip we're going to see is all of Act 5, Scene 1 of the play. So it's about 6 minutes long in total. And to give some context for this scene, the tyrannical husband, Lord Priory, has given his permission for the rake, Bronsley, to have an interview with his wife, Lady Priory. And Lord Priory's done this as a show of confidence in Lady Priory's fidelity to him. However, when left alone, Bronsley, here played by James Wallace, uses this as an opportunity to take Lady Priory away from her house and out of London and to one of his own houses, and there he intends to seduce, possibly also, if she doesn't consent, rape her. So in this clip we're about to see, Bronsley is played by James Wallace and Lady Priory is played by Joanna Tinsey. Is that visible to our participants? Can someone just nod to let me know that it's visible? Good.
me to you, and upon an errand which I feared to deliver till I had arrived at a house of my own.
What is the errand?
To tell you, I love you.
You assert Lord Priory sent you to me for this?
I assert that in triumph at your betraying to him our private appointment, he gave me leave to have a second trial. If then you have ever harbored one wish to revenge and forsake a churlish, ungrateful partner, never return to him more, but remain with me.
And what shall I have gained by the exchange? When you become churlish, when you become ungrateful, my children's shame, the world's contempt, and yours. Come, you are but jesting, Mr. Bronsley. You will not affront my little share of common sense by making a serious offer of so bad a bargain. Come, own the jest. Take me home immediately.
Is it impossible for me to excite your tenderness?
Yes, it's utterly impossible.
I will then rouse your terror!
Even that, I defy.
Lady Priory, you are in a lonely house of mine where I am sole master and all the servants slaves to my will. This composure is worse than reproach. A woman who meant to yield would be outraged. By heaven, she looks so respectable in that employment, I'm afraid to insult her. Ha! Don't you fear me?
No. Your fears will protect me. I have no occasion for my own.
What have I to fear?
You fear no more to lounge at routs, at balls, at operas, in Bond Street. No more to dance in circles, or chat in side boxes, or roar at taverns. For you've observed enough upon the events of life to know that an atrocious offence, like violence to a woman, never escapes condign punishment.
Oh, for once, let your mind be as feminine as your person. Hear the vows.
You see, did not I tell you, you were afraid? It is you who is afraid of me. Oh, come, you are ashamed too. I see that you are, and I pardon you. In requital, suffer me to return home immediately. How? Are not you ashamed of yourself?
I was not this moment, but now you mention it, I think I am.
Repent your folly, then, and take me home.
But can you wish to go back to the man who has made this trial of your fidelity and not resent his conduct?
Most assuredly, I wish to return. But if you deliver me safe, perfectly safe, from further insult, it will be impossible for me not to show resentment to Lord Priory.
Why only in that case?
Because only in that case you will make an impression on my heart, and I will resent his having exposed me to such temptation.
Oh! I'll take you home directly at this moment! I make an impression on your heart. I'll take you home directly. But upon my life, it will be a hard task. I cannot do it, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I cannot. Oh, besides, what are we to say when we go back? Oh, no matter what. So you will but think kindly of me? We will return to London immediately. And quick, for fear I should change my mind. aren't stealing away already. Now they are flying rapidly. Please to look another way. I shall certainly recant if I see your face. And now should I have the resolution to take you straight to your husband, you will have made a more contemptible figure of me by this last trick than by anyone you have yet played me.
I hope you found that as brilliant as I did. And I think in 6 minutes, we have all of the genius, as well as the radicalism, both in terms of stagecraft and in terms of politics, that all of our participants have been talking about. I want to throw open this roundtable for questions in a moment. Before I do, I just wondered if any of our panelists had anything they wanted to say about the scene that we've just watched.
I wanted to sort of build on something Colin did in his work. And one of the things that Inchbald, again, needs work on is repertory studies, because Colin's right. There are a lot of playwrights in her period. And for instance, Somerset Maugham followed them and wrote about divorce. And Inchbald was so great that her plays, Frances Brooks and Hannah Cowley's, were often the entire program at Covent Garden, night after night. And so when he's talking about the audience, he's right. We need to factor that in much more and with the repertory, because if she weren't what she was and her plays hadn't been received by the audience as he described, and still they do, we wouldn't get the Covent Garden repertory as it was. And certainly not with those 3 women playwrights being the entire program in a variety of amazing combinations. So thanks, Colin.
You're welcome.
I guess I want to pick up one of the lines in the scene too, where something that I think was kind of underlined in all of our comments. You know, her role as what kind of a feminist, if we want to use that term, she was, right? Where that moment where the question is by Lady Prairie, what do I have to gain from this exchange? Right, a very clear-headed sense, right, of the stakes, and what is to be gained and what is to be lost. And I just love the way that Inchbald brings that out and allows her female characters, right, this sort of the status of someone who can analyze their current situation and make decisions based on that. What do I have to gain? So again, thank you, Colin, for that wonderful scene.
And at the risk of being master of the obvious, this is such a fantastic illustration of how Inchbald on the page, where we have weighty questions, we have a situation that could easily turn into a rape, up against these elements of physical comedy, this extraordinary dramaturgical set of insights. And Colin, you and your team just brought that out so beautifully. Knitting needles, and then that fantastic moment where she puts her bag up against her face. Right. These are the materials of burlesque, a term that Inchbald always used with disdain, right? But put to a new purpose, repurposed physical comedy.
These are things that come out naturally out of a rehearsal process. I think, I can't remember, but I think the knitting is written into the script.
Yes.
But I don't think the lifting of the bag is. And I think if the knitting hadn't been written into the script, Jo is such a brilliant actor anyway that she would have come up with something. And you know, we've worked on so many plays where there are even fewer stage directions than there are in Inchbald. And this is the actor's genius, that they can interpret whatever it is that the writer is intending, or at least what they think the writer is intending, and come out with a physical manifestation of something that will deliver the goods, both in terms of its technical ability to deliver the comedy of it, or indeed its more serious and potentially more profound intention of bringing a political or a social issue to light.
Going back to what people have said about her awareness of and the importance of actors, her first plays, Covent Garden's company did not know she wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
And she started telling Mrs. Wells how one of the parts should be performed. And Wells, who was her friend, was very angry about it. And we have a few of those anecdotes surviving. And it's just such a nice way to show how right Lisa is about she never forgot the performance and the text, and certainly her ownership of her play, to speak out with the company and say, no, no, this is the way.
And she had the authority to do that because, of course, although she was a bad one, she was an actor.
So if people have comments or questions, now is the time to you can either put something into the chat, or you can put your microphone and camera on and ask the question, or make the comment directly. We welcome all comments and questions.
Rose Hilton has her hand up, David.
Oh, thank you, Rose.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you all so much. This is so wonderful, and I'm also redrafting a thesis chapter on Inchbald at the minute, so this is perfect. I wondered if anyone had anything they wanted to say about Inchbald as a translator and an adapter, and the kind of influences of like French and German theatre on her work. Or if you don't.
Actually, I remember stumbling upon that. There was a French writer that maybe you could tell us something about. Let's see if I can. It was Dumaniat, and she translated 3 of his plays into Midnight Hour, Animal Magnetism, and Hue and Cry. And although I was supposed to know French, back when I was editing, I just like, oh my gosh. So maybe you can, I think that's so important. Maybe other people have worked on her use of Dumaniat, and certainly we know more about her work with Kotzebue's plays, but there you go. Can you enlighten us?
Not really, like I hadn't heard of Dumaniat, so thank you. I'm looking at The Widow's Vow, which is a translation of Patrat's but I'm looking at it in contrast with with Wives, so kind of navigating how I talk about the translation and adaptation aspect is a weird thing, because I don't speak French either. So,
I guess I would say, Rose, one of the things that I think is so important about Inchbald and the way that she comments on translations, etc., is, she really thinks of the art of translation not as literally translating, word for word, but as a kind of transposition. That it's adaptation at the same time that it's translation, and it's adapted towards one's particular sort of cultural milieu, that you can't just simply take a French play and turn it into an English play without understanding the English stage, the English context, and the entire sort of history and genealogy of English theater. And so, it's a very sophisticated understanding of translation, and not a simplistic one. And that's something I really appreciate, the way that in the way that Inchbald thought about both that kind of work that she did herself and how to approach that in thinking as a critic.
In fact, she changed the genre of Dumaniat's plays. So her translation was really what they were calling Englishing.
thank you so much. That's brilliant.
Just on that point, it's also worth noting that she taught herself French, didn't she, pretty much, she started to have, I think, some French lessons, and then basically taught herself French during her years as a strolling actress, which is another remarkable aspect of Inchbald's life and career.
I have experience of both Lover's Vows and Animal Mag, because we did Animal Magnetism, which was a huge amount of fun. I haven't really got any enlightenment to offer you about her ability as a translator for that, but the Kotzebue, I thought, I mean, frankly, I think that's one of her less successful ventures into theatrical excellence. I find both the original, which I have read in German, and Inchbald's translation of it, very dull, and it lacks the spark, it lacks the gossamer texture of her own original work, which is a real temptation, I think, when you're working with other people's work. You tend to ape them, you tend to honor them, and I know this because at the moment I'm trying to use a play by a French writer called Carton to create a new piece of restoration dramatic literature, and it's really difficult because you take the original and it has a certain degree of weight that you always feel you need to honor, and I think Inchbald fell into that trap a little bit, certainly with Lover's Vows, not so much with the other one.
So we have questions from Jean Marsden and then from Tracy Davis. Jean.
This has been wonderful. I love Inchbald. And one thing I've really enjoyed about your discussion is how many things people have brought back to the audience. It's one thing I've been interested in with Inchbald is her awareness, not just simply of performance, but of the audience. And that's something, Lisa, certainly you were speaking of, and that you were as well, Colin. That might be something for Rose to consider, is with translation, her knowledge of the English audience and who would be listening to and appreciating what was going on the stage. And Colin, I just wonder what the response would have been to Lover's Vows. It certainly was popular enough. It does come off kind of leaden now, and we know it largely because of Mansfield Park.
We read it twice when we were in Bury doing the series of Restoring the Repertoire. We just did public readings of it. And there was a moment when we were going to reopen the theatre with it because of its celebrity rather than because of its quality. And I have to admit that every time we read it in public, there was a kind of an appreciation of it rather than an enjoyment of it. And so we chose not to use it. Interestingly, I directed a new adaptation of Mansfield Park later on, and I just felt very smug because I'd read the play in the middle of it.
You know, when I teach Mansfield Park, I try to have my students act out some of the scenes because they don't understand the whole business with Agatha and Frederick, and just how often they do embrace.
Yeah.
That was mainly my comment and question. Do the other panelists have anything to contribute on that? Have you read Lover's Vows?
What's the relationship to Werther? Like, was that, I mean, I thought she was reaching into that tone that we came to know from the Passion about that. I don't know the years right now.
I very much want to hear Tracy's question, but I draw everyone's attention to Jane's comment in the chat about the DC production in 2019, and that there may be a case to be made for Poor Little Lover's Vows, which I too find leaden and have never successfully, done a scene. But it may be that it just needs to be in the right hands.
That's always possible.
It's interesting though that that play does have a certain kind of celebrity because it, you know, appears in Austen's Mansfield Park, and that it probably isn't the best first place to encounter Inchbald. Again, by comparison with something like what we've just seen from Wives as They Were. Let's take a question from Tracy Davis.
Thanks very much. I'm really enjoying this. And I want to come back to the scene that we watched together, because I see so clearly in Colin's staging how Inchbald built in an unconventional dynamic rebalancing of how a woman can use, let's call them tools of the week, to borrow a phrase, in an otherwise standard plot device. And we can still see how this works. And we can also still see how it remains fresh vis-a-vis the back and forth of gendered power in that scene. So my question is, because the panelists have such comprehensive knowledge of Inchbald's corpus and the critical tradition, would you say that this kind of intelligence about character and plotting, this kind of ingenuity, was well understood and appreciated at the time? And is that partly how we account for the popularity and longevity of her comedies on the stage?
So I suppose I challenge the end at the beginning, which is to say I'm not sure they do have popularity and longevity. We all love them for what they are, but a public at large and the industry that's tasked with purveying them to the public at large tend either not to know them or to have fallen out of love with them at some point in time. And I think obviously, because I'm a devotee, I think that's a real mistake. I suppose the first part of your question for me is ever so slight, and I'm going to be a little bit contentious here, ever so slightly irrelevant, because for me what's important, and remember I'm no academic, for me what's important is that they sing now rather than how they play to an audience then. We can learn stuff about how they play to an audience then, and the main thing I've learned from the productions that one reads about at the time that the play was written is again going back to that centrally important dynamic of the audience and the play and how those two things interact. And if you build into that the architecture of the building and how significantly important that was, you begin to get a sense of a segregated hierarchical audience watching a play about exactly those things. And that feels to me an important thing to draw from the Mists of Time. But what's important to me now is that those plays do work with an audience, whether it's segregated or not, whether the lights are left on or not, and that it does the job that theatre and drama is supposed to do, and that's touch the heart and stimulate the grey cells. For me, it's not an academic pursuit, and it never has been. And in fact, I always used to say when we were doing these things, if we ever do library theatre, we've failed in our attempt to do what we're trying to do. So I've not been very helpful in answering your question at all, Tracy. I'm sorry.
Tracy, I took your comment about how popular she was for a long time, beginning when our plays first came out. That's the way I took your question. And, you know, year after year, hers were the most performed plays of the season. And if you read the reviews, they saw exactly what you're acting. They would talk about, here is the most tiresome, romantic courtship plot we know, and look what happens. So, and I don't think the reviewers were that different back then from a whole bunch of the audience. So I think that's a really interesting question. And again, it's something else we really haven't. I think Misty has this theoretical idea of convention, invention. And you find that in the reviews of her plays for the next 20 or 30 years, or even as late as Genest. So there's another answer to your great question.
And if I could jump in on what Paula just said and add to it, you know, the yes and of understanding her star system. And this is just an anecdotal example, but the original Lord Priory was played by the great comic actor Quick. You know, she knew how to bounce her experiments off of a star system. And that is, for us now, an academic question, right? You know, but for us now, it is also a production question. What would that look like now? And I think that that the experiments are so sturdy and so successful that we could still take advantage of that relationship between a plot that has very, very strongly conventional first outlines and what happens when you really layer in a deeper sense of character motivation and expectation.
Sorry, David, I just want to add to that just the one little footnote, which is that she had written wives as they are with Elizabeth Farren in mind. And at the very end of her own remarks, she said, well, Elizabeth Farren would have played so-and-so, except that she moved on to greener pastures, which is to say she married up and out of the theater, which might be of interest to Katie, about how Elizabeth Inchbald was watching the sort of whole ecosystem of how women circulated through the theater and how she operated as a playwright, of course, with different particular actors in mind, knowing who could pick up on the parts she designed and add certain kinds of stage business and stagecraft to bring out the comedic aspects, even in the tense moments that she was designing. So, yeah.
We have a question from Madeline Salenberg.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I find that I'm rather ignorant of Elizabeth Inchbald's life and that portion of her plays and her criticism, and I was really curious within some of these conversations about the tension between sort of page and stage, and you know, the idea that she sort of wrote her life story and then burned it. And that, you know, she had this sort of body of criticism and then also this body of playwriting work. And I was curious if that's a tension that has been sort of imposed backwards on her work, or if that's something that we know about, you know, that she was interested in sort of thinking of her writerly life as separate from her acting and playwriting life.
It's difficult for I have to admit to some. I suppose I've had a subjective interpretation of this because I went into it wanting to find her core as a human being, and that being my objective in looking into this. And so I will tell you exactly how I feel about it, but owning that it's subjective, and that to a degree with someone like Inchbald, there has to be some subjectivity in it, because there isn't, you know, we've got her daily notes, we've got some letters from her and things, but we don't have the level of detail that we do about other historical figures, for this exact reason that she wanted to keep herself private. But everything that I read and how I interpreted the way that she actually wrote was very much that she viewed those things as separate. Her private life was entirely separate to her public persona. She needed to keep it that way in order to maintain her success. And that there was this very tangible tension of her wanting to, you know, she sat around tables with some of the most extraordinary radicals in London at the time, having conversations about huge shifts that were going on in the world. And then she was able to put work on the biggest stages in London, in front of vast audiences. But she was clever enough to understand that she could only dip into those points of radical interest in a very stealthy way. So she was very stealthy about it. And I think, you know, I was just thinking as we were watching that clip and then talking about it afterwards, that, you know, I would love to see the version of that was on her stage. because acting was so different then, performance was so different then, and the way that modern actors interpret things in terms of emotional connection, the level of nuance, the level of detail that those actors bring to that scene, that's not how it would have been performed originally. And therefore, I think it would have been much easier for the audience to take what they wanted to take from it. They might be able to interpret, she has some very strong radical views in this, but they might also go, that was jolly good fun, ha, 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 lol, and just have had a lovely evening at the theatre. And so I think that for me, that the cleverness in her work came from the fact that in her life, she understood the way society worked, the way she had to be in order to protect herself. And I don't know. I don't know if she felt sad to never have another, to not remarry or to have that, but that was a choice she made to protect herself again. You know, she was always making these choices to protect herself. She kept herself independent even from her husband while they were married. You know, she made all these choices to protect herself. And I think for me, that just shows that she was very savvy, but there's such a strong beating heart in her and all of her work. And I just wonder if she had an open flaw in the way she would do now, what she'd actually say and how she'd say it, you know. I don't know if I've meandered off the original point there, Madeline, but that's my feeling on it.
I think that's a great question, but no one who puts a mirror over her, you know, a sheet over her mirror while she writes is really separating their external life from their writing and acting life. And that's why the question that just haunts me about her is, what was the persona she performed? It couldn't have been that acceptable to have tea every day with William Godwin, could it? So that's what some of you all need to. We need another chapter from you, Katie, and show her performing, you know, tea with Godwin and then getting these plays saying bread is so expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Katie, did you feel when you were writing and performing the Celebrated Mrs Inchbald that to some extent you were providing that figure? You know, that you said about, you know, the fact that what we don't have is, you know, what would she have said if she could have, if you know, restraint wasn't an issue, you know, as it would be today. If she could speak freely as she could speak today. Did you feel you were trying to provide that Inchbald, or rather did you feel you were trying to write an Inchbald who was absolutely involved in that intricate negotiation of ethics?
Absolutely, the negotiation, yes, I would say, yes. And that I think what's extraordinary about her is, you know, well, what's extraordinary about her, there are many extraordinary things about her, but, you know, she had very clear, very strong, very well thought through opinions about most things. And she must have, with this, for example, the publication of her life, she obviously wanted to do that. She wrote that. It would have been a beautiful piece of writing and an extraordinary piece of writing. And yet, what I believe is that negotiation that you've just mentioned there, David, is the reason why she ultimately ended up not publishing it, and in fact burning it so nobody ever could find it posthumously and then out her in whatever way that it would. And I think that was a decision that she made because she wanted to protect her work, and she believed her work was her legacy and her work was what was going to leave her remembered. But I think that the fact that her work was not the vindication of the rights of women and was not something which now can be looked at and go, look at how clearly feminist or groundbreaking this is the reason why, beyond this beautiful circle of people on Zoom, it's not widely remembered. So yeah, very much that negotiation. And you know, in the same breath, you know, there's all the other layers to her of just how, in the midst of all of that, she was this incredibly silly, playful, just human woman who just loved to rap on strangers' doors and then run away again afterwards as a game with children who she knew, you know. So she's so multifaceted. I wouldn't want to presume that I could give her that voice, but I was very keen to delve into that, as you say, that complex negotiation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We've really kind of run out of time here. So thanks to those who have asked questions, which have been fascinating to hear, and fascinating to hear our panelists respond to. Something I should have said at the start, which is that this event is organised by the R18 Collective. We're a group of scholars who are interested in restoration and 18th century theatre, and we're particularly interested in making this largely forgotten repertory, forgotten certainly in terms of what's being performed. We're interested in finding ways to work with theatre makers to make this repertory live again in the ways, for instance, that Colin and also that Katie have described, which is why it's been so exciting to see that clip and to speak and to hear all of our speakers today. Do go and, if you've not done so already, do go and check out our website, r18collective.org. Misty has helpfully posted that link in the chat. The other thing to say is that we are using this roundtable to mark the 200th anniversary of Inchbald's death. Originally, we had planned to hold a conference, a 2-day conference to mark the occasion. Obviously, the pandemic of the last 18 months has deferred that, but it's only deferred it. And I'm pleased to say here that we will be holding a 2-day conference on Inchbald in Oxford in September 2022. Watch this space, as we say, for further details about that. The conference will feature a script in hand reading of one of Inchbald's plays directed by our very own Colin Blumenau. So I can't think what possibly I could say more to tempt you to attend that conference, and perhaps pitch a paper as well. As I say, a CFP for that will be coming imminently. On that note, let me just thank my 5 wonderful panelists for such a stimulating discussion. I feel this could go on and on. I don't want it to end, but I'm also aware that there's such a thing as Zoom fatigue, and that everyone's probably ready for either their dinner or lunch or breakfast, depending on their time zones. So thanks to PAULA, to Lisa, to Misty, to Katie, and to Colin for contributing so much to today's roundtable. Really, I appreciate it, and I'm sure we all do. And thanks to all of you for attending. So on that note, I'll say goodbye.